The retirement he waited 40 years for is slowly destroying him. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a house at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, one that many men spent 40 years dreaming about, and almost none of them were actually prepared for. No alarm clock. No commute. No meetings. No deadlines. No urgent phone calls demanding immediate attention. Just an empty kitchen, a cup of coffee going cold, and a day stretching out ahead of him with absolutely nothing requiring his presence anywhere at all. This is retirement, the reward he waited 4 decades to receive, and the wise observer has watched, with real concern, how often this long-anticipated gift quietly becomes one of the most destabilizing experiences of a man's entire life. Not because rest itself is dangerous, and not because leisure is inherently harmful, but because for many men of this generation, work was never simply a job. It was the primary architecture of identity itself, and removing that architecture all at once can leave behind something that looks disturbingly like collapse. To understand why retirement hits so many of these men so hard, the wise observer must look at what work actually provided beyond a paycheck. For decades, a job gave him structure, purpose, a clear daily measure of his own competence and worth. It gave him a title he could offer when meeting someone new, an answer to the question, "What do you do?" that felt solid and legitimate. It gave him colleagues who depended on him, deadlines that made him feel needed, small daily victories that accumulated into a durable sense of being valuable in the world. When all of that disappears simultaneously, on a single Friday afternoon, what's left behind isn't simply free time. It's often a genuine void where his entire sense of self used to live. Consider how differently this transition unfolds than most people expect. The first few weeks often feel genuinely wonderful sleeping in, tackling long postponed home projects, finally reading books that sat untouched on a nightstand for years. But the wise observer has watched this initial relief consistently fade within a matter of months, replaced by something far more troubling, a growing, disorienting sense that the days have no shape, that time itself has become slippery and directionless in a way that feels less like freedom and more like drifting. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this shift precisely. A man who spent 40 years waking at 5:30 every morning finds himself, 6 months into retirement, still awake at that same hour, lying in bed with genuinely nothing that needs to happen next. He gets up anyway, out of old habit, and stands in his kitchen making coffee he doesn't particularly want, because the ritual itself feels like the only remaining evidence that his life still has any structure at all. By 9 in the morning, he's already run out of tasks. By noon, the day feels unbearably long. By evening, he's exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical effort and everything to do with the particular fatigue of having nowhere to direct himself. The wise observer wants to name something important here. This isn't laziness catching up with him, and it isn't simply an adjustment period that naturally resolves with time. For many men, retirement triggers something closer to a genuine identity crisis, a confrontation with an uncomfortable question he never had to ask directly during his working years. Who am I, when I'm not producing anything? For a man who spent his entire adult life answering that question through work, silence on that front can feel less like peace and more like disappearing. This crisis often intensifies specifically because of how quietly it unfolds. There's no dramatic single event marking the decline, no obvious crisis point that would prompt intervention from concerned family members. Instead, there's a slow, almost invisible erosion, slightly less energy each week, slightly more time spent staring at a television he isn't really watching, slightly less interest in activities that used to bring him genuine pleasure. Family members often struggle to name exactly what's changed, only that something clearly has, and that the vibrant, purposeful man they knew during his working years seems to be quietly fading into someone smaller, someone less certain of his own place in the world. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with his social world specifically. Many of the friendships and daily interactions that structured his working life simply don't survive the transition into retirement. Co-workers he saw daily for decades fade from regular contact within months. The easy camaraderie of a workplace, built on shared tasks and daily proximity, doesn't automatically transfer into deliberate, effortful friendship maintenance, a skill many men from this generation, as discussed elsewhere, never fully developed. Retirement removes not just his job, but the entire social infrastructure that job quietly provided for decades, leaving him facing both an identity crisis and a friendship crisis simultaneously. There's a specific tenderness worth naming in how this affects his marriage too, particularly in the early years of retirement. A wife who spent decades managing a household during his working hours often finds herself suddenly sharing every single day with a husband who has no external structure of his own, sometimes leading to genuine friction neither partner fully anticipated. He may hover, uncertain what to do with himself, inadvertently disrupting routines she built carefully over years. She may find herself, gently but firmly, encouraging him to find something, anything, that gives his days shape again, not out of impatience, but out of genuine concern for a man she can see quietly struggling. The wise observer wants to point out something particularly painful about how this crisis often gets minimized, even by the man experiencing it directly. Admitting that retirement, the reward he spent decades anticipating, is actually making him miserable can feel like an embarrassing confession, almost ungrateful given how many people genuinely long for the freedom he now has. This makes the struggle even harder to name honestly, even to himself, let alone to a family that assumes he should simply be enjoying this well-earned chapter of his life. There's a particular danger worth naming directly, because the stakes here are genuinely serious. Studies on retirement and mental health consistently point to elevated risks of depression and even mortality in the years immediately following retirement, particularly for men whose identity was heavily invested in their careers. This isn't a minor adjustment issue to be waved away with platitudes about finally relaxing. For a meaningful number of men, retirement without a replacement source of purpose represents a genuine health crisis hiding behind a socially celebrated milestone. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how differently this experience unfolds for men who do manage to find genuine purpose after leaving formal work behind. Volunteering, mentoring younger workers, finally pursuing a long-postponed passion project, becoming genuinely, deeply present. As a grandfather, these paths don't happen automatically, simply because time has opened up. They require the same kind of deliberate, effortful construction that a career once provided involuntarily, and men who successfully make this transition almost universally describe having to treat the search for new purpose as seriously and intentionally as they once treated their careers. There's a particular irony worth naming in how many men prepare meticulously for the financial dimension of retirement while completely neglecting the psychological one. He may spend years consulting financial advisors, calculating pension projections, and yet almost none of that same care gets directed toward what he'll actually do with his time or who he'll actually be once the paycheck stops. The financial architecture gets built with tremendous care. The psychological architecture is simply assumed to sort itself out, an assumption that frequently proves devastatingly wrong. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up in the first few months after retirement, a period many researchers describe as a honeymoon phase that gives way to something far more difficult. During this stretch, the novelty of unstructured time genuinely feels liberating. Sleeping in, a Tuesday afternoon hike, finally tackling postponed home projects. Family members often comment on how relaxed he seems, which makes the subsequent decline, when it arrives, even more disorienting to name, precisely because everyone expected this freedom to simply keep feeling good. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this crisis often gets discovered, almost by accident, by the people closest to him. His wife notices, gradually, that he's stopped getting dressed some mornings, choosing instead to remain in pajamas well into the afternoon, something entirely uncharacteristic of a man who spent 4 decades getting up, showering, and dressing with disciplined regularity before any workday. This small detail, easy to dismiss individually, often becomes one of the first visible signals that something deeper has shifted, a quiet erosion of the daily structure and self-presentation that used to feel automatic and effortless. The wise observer wants to point out something important about how this crisis intersects with his relationship to his own physical health during this period. Men experiencing this particular kind of retirement-related depression often show measurable declines in physical activity, diet quality, and sleep regularity, not because retirement itself causes physical decline directly, but because the structure that used to organize healthy habits, a commute that forced regular waking hours, a lunch break that created eating structure, physical activity built into a job that required movement disappears all at once, leaving him without the scaffolding that previously supported healthy routines almost invisibly. It's worth noting, too, how this pattern shows up specifically in men who held positions of authority or respect during their careers, a particularly difficult adjustment for those accustomed to being deferred to, consulted, and valued for specialized expertise. A man who spent decades as the person other people turn to for answers can find genuine identity vertigo in a world where no one needs his expertise anymore, where his opinion on operational matters that once carried real weight now has nowhere relevant to land. This loss of professional relevance, distinct from simple loss of routine, often produces its own particular grief that rarely gets named directly, even by the man experiencing it. There's a tender complexity worth naming in how differently men respond to help during this period, depending on how it's framed. Suggestions that feel like being managed, "You should find a hobby," often get met with quiet resistance. But invitations that preserve his sense of competence, a genuine request for his expertise, and ask for mentorship rather than busy work, tend to land far more successfully, restoring, even briefly, the feeling of being needed that retirement stripped away. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge the particular grief embedded in watching this pattern unfold as an adult child, powerless to fix a parent's crisis but painfully aware that something has shifted. Many adult children describe a specific ache watching a formerly vibrant, purposeful father slowly diminish into someone quieter, less engaged, less himself, without quite knowing how to intervene in a transition that seems, on its surface, like it should have been a purely positive milestone. This confusion, grief over something that's supposed to be celebrated, adds its own layer of difficulty to an already complicated family dynamic. There's one final observation worth naming, because it offers a specific, practical path forward rather than simply describing the problem. Men who successfully rebuild purpose after retirement almost universally describe the importance of maintaining at least one commitment with external accountability, a volunteer shift someone is actually expecting him for, a mentorship relationship with real obligations attached, a regular class or group that notices his absence if he doesn't show up. The specific activity matters less than the accountability structure itself, which recreates, in miniature, the exact sense of being needed that a career once provided automatically. There's real hope embedded in this pattern, though it requires honest acknowledgement before it can be accessed. Many men do eventually find their way through this crisis, often after a period of genuine struggle that deserves to be named rather than minimized. The men who navigate it most successfully tend to be the ones who stop waiting for purpose to arrive naturally and instead actively build it, reaching out to old colleagues intentionally, committing to a volunteer schedule with the same discipline once reserved for work deadlines, treating retirement not as an ending but as a genuine second career, requiring its own deliberate architecture. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you are a man discovering that the retirement you waited 40 years for feels less like freedom and more like disappearing, understand that this struggle is neither shameful nor unusual, and it certainly isn't ingratitude for a life you're supposed to simply enjoy. The identity you built through decades of work doesn't automatically transfer into a life of leisure. It has to be rebuilt, deliberately, piece by piece, into something new that can hold your sense of purpose just as reliably as your career once did. The reward you waited so long for is still there, waiting patiently underneath the disorientation, but reaching it requires exactly the same effort and intention you once brought to every working day, redirected now toward building a life rather than simply filling time.